Yeah, so indeed, I was asked to tell you a little bit about writing of grant applications, and you can think, okay, that's very boring, and maybe it's not really applicable to you now, but I can guarantee you that if you want to pursue a career in academia, there is a stage when you will need to write grant applications yourself. And actually, my way to Lisbon in the plane, I actually thought, well, let's expand a little bit and not only talk about the writing part of the grant, but actually what I would like to do is just take you to the process from A to Z, from how do you develop an idea until the process of the final decision of whether or not your grant applications is awarded to you or not. So that includes some more steps, as I will discuss with you. Just for your information, I obtained my PhD in 2006, exactly 10 years ago, so June 2006. And my first grant application was in the last year of my PhD project, and it was sort of a talent fellowship from our university to obtain just salary for 1 year. And I used that time basically to think about my first real grant application and also to finish up some of the papers, because I think that's what most of you will experience, that in the year after your PhD contract finishes, you still need to write up some of your data. Okay, so please feel free to ask questions and to interrupt me if things are not clear, or if you just have questions about a certain topic within the grant application process that I'm talking about. So what I would like to do is first briefly discuss the basis for a new proposal. So I mean writing a grant application, but why would you do so? I would like to talk a little bit about the funding organization and the funding scheme, because I think it's crucial that you think about where to apply for a grant, the funding organization. And then the important step, of course, coming from a bright idea, a research question, to really your project proposal. Then the writing process, so what is important to pay attention to. From my opinion, and it might be good that I start off by saying that, of course, what I put here today in this presentation is based on my own experiences, and of course the tips and tricks that I received when I was a PhD student from my supervisors, who already, of course, had written several grant applications. So it's, and I will also talk a little bit about my own experiences throughout this entire process. So then, of course, when you have written the proposal and you submit it, you get some comments by international reviewers who will judge your grant, and you need to, usually you need to reply to that, so a rebuttal that you need to write. So what is important to do and also not to do when you write a rebuttal. And finally, I would like to end with what I think some helpful take-home messages. And hopefully, if you're not at the stage yet to write the grant applications, maybe you think about this presentation, and it will be online, you get the slides. So maybe in 2 years from now, you can just take these slides and have a look at the handouts again. It might be helpful, hopefully, for you. So, as I said, I will, for several of these points, I will just give you an example about one of the research lines that I'm involved in, and the problems and also the successes that I've experienced myself. So I think the basis of a new proposal is really a successful project you've been working on, or a certain research line. That can also be the past performance of your supervisors, right? So it's not always that based on your own data that you can write a grant. It's also, of course, about the research group you're embedded within. If they've done some nice work, you can just follow up on that and write your own proposal together with them, right? As in a sort of a project team. And of course, it's important that it's relevant for the field of research. Otherwise, you need to convince reviewers about that. Why would you need the money to do so? So the time has come when you need to start writing. It's when you have developed, of course, your own hypothesis. And that can be really a novel hypothesis, giving a novel view on the field. That is sometimes quite helpful. But it can also be just a novel approach to test an existing hypothesis. So you don't have to always develop a completely new hypothesis. I think that's also important to mention. And preferably, and I'll come back to that also in a minute, you have already gathered some pilot data to support your hypothesis. You can have a bright idea that is out of the box, which is good, that can also be seen as a high-risk project because there's not many data to substantiate your hypothesis. So it would be really good if you were able to, with a little bit of amount of money, to get some pilot data, either in the lab, right, or in some in vivo measurements in 1 or 2 subjects that you have measured. But importantly, there is always then, and that is what you should think about when writing the grant, what is really the knowledge gap? So what do we don't know yet? In other words, what kind of studies are lacking? So that can be very interesting data, hypothesis tested in animals, but not yet in humans. So you can say, okay, this is known from animal work. I want to translate that to humans. But it can also be, for example, giving the field an extra boost by going from association studies to more causality. That is also, of course, advancement of the field. So what about the funding organization? So say you have a very good idea, you have thought about it, and you think, yes, the time is there to write the grant applications, but where to submit? So before you start with the writing process, think about the funding organizations. So what are the things that I think at least you should consider? That is the available budget per application. So do you apply for a grant where you can get 50,000 euros or a grant where you can get 300,000 euros? That's important because you have an idea and you need to think about what do I need for that. So if you're a PI, you have to think, okay, do I need 1, 2, 3 PhD students working on the project? Consumables, so the money involved in all the consumables you need to perform the study. So if that's, as we also do a lot in our department, complex human invasive studies, sometimes with certain traces and so on, that costs a lot of money. So I could have a brilliant idea, but if the budget available per application is just like 40,000 euros, or just, it sounds, but that's not a lot for the studies that we would like to do. So then it's, of course, no use to think about that organization. Also relevant could be the total budget that is available. What I mean with that is actually, what are your chances? So sometimes you think, okay, this is a nice grant, but if you know that only 2% of the applications is granted, you can think, okay, maybe I should go for a little bit smaller grant, but the success rate might be higher. And success rates are usually known. You can just look it up, and often it's said that only the top 10 will get the grant, for example. So it's something you should consider and just get an idea of what would be my chances to really get the money. You should also think about fundamental versus applied research. So, and that differs between countries, but in the Netherlands also you have some organizations where you really can only submit fundamental research. So if you're doing more research on implementation of things, no way that you will get money. So why wasting your time and putting such a grant in? So that is also important. And you can also look at, that's also usually on the websites, a list of previous projects that have been granted. And you can say, okay, are there projects more or less similar to what I want to do? That's also, for example, from the European Foundation for the Study of Obesity. They have on their website, I think, 10 years, from 10 years back or something, every year who received grants for what kind of projects. It gives you an idea of, does that funding organization would be interested in my kind of research. The next one is personal grants versus grants for an entire project group. Sounds quite logic, but it's important that you think about that. So are you going for a personal grant, or do you think, well, I'm at the early stage of my career, so maybe together with my supervisor I can write a nice project, and maybe with some international collaborators. And also, oh, that's actually what I already mentioned, have comparable projects been funded by the organization? So you can always check the website of that organization and see what projects have been funded. And this is really at the bottom of the list, but some researchers think about the prestige, right? Oh, if I get that grant, it's good for my CV. I usually don't, what I would like to do, or what my goal is to get money to do good research, right? And if it's prestige or not, I don't care. But for some it's important, right, to have nice grants on your CV. So then, which funding scheme to choose? And I would, maybe you're aware of that, but I would just like to briefly touch upon the different kind of grants that are available. So first of all, I already briefly referred to that, the personal grants. And usually there is a fixed time period when you can apply for that. And that can be like up to 7 years after obtaining your PhD or whatsoever. So that is of course also important. When can you apply for a personal grant? Usually these grants are quite prestigious. it's really good to have those grants on your CV. And then, especially if you're the principal investigator, your CV is quite important. And I think I have it on one of the next slides. Usually it's 50% based on your CV and 50% based on the real project proposal you've written. So past performance is quite important when you talk about personal grants. And usually they're granted to the top 10 or 20% of the researchers in your field. You also have the program or project grants, and that's actually irrespective of the career stage. So also full professors can apply, but also postdocs or whatever. Also prestigious, well, most grants are prestigious, but program grants usually are more money involved, quite prestigious projects. The project group is really important, and again, the CV of the principal investigator is important. Sometimes, for example, for NIH grants, a domestic collaboration is required. So for some grants, I can apply for Wellcome Trust grants in the UK without collaborating with somebody from the UK, for example. Sometimes that's possible, not always. So check that before you want to submit a grant to a certain funding organization. But usually these project grants have a relatively low success rate, usually less than 10%. To give you an example, and nowadays it's more difficult to get money, right, due to the economical climate. But in the Netherlands, if I want to apply for a grant at the Dutch Diabetes Research Foundation, last year about 60 grants were submitted and only one was granted in the field of type 2 diabetes. That's not a lot, right? That's, what is it? 1.5% success rate. And you need to do quite a lot of work. But I mean, sometimes you need to go for it. And then you have, in several countries, maybe you use a different term, but in the Netherlands we have something like innovative pilot grants, also for example for the Dutch Diabetes Research Foundation. Again, that it does not depend on the career stage. The CV of the PI is a little bit less important there, because it's about pilot work. It doesn't really matter if you have a past performance, if you have a novel idea that you want to test, usually that's fine and you don't need to have a full list of publications. Usually a limited amount of money is involved and the success rate is relatively high. And I'll come back to that. So it's quite important to choose your battle, I always say, right? So if you're in the early phase of your career, don't go for $1 million grant or something. That's not realistic, right? So sometimes you should start a little bit less ambitious maybe, but still ambitious, but be a little bit more clever maybe. So from research question to project proposal. So what are the steps that you should go through? Of course, the literature survey. You should know what is done already and where are the research gaps. Does your research idea fit within the findings in literature? So don't only cite papers from your own research group. We've done this and this. Of course, you should do that, but not only. So make sure to the reviewers that you have a good idea of the field you're working in. And make sure that your novel ideas bridge a certain gap. So that's the knowledge gap I was talking about. What does your research add to the current knowledge? Sometimes it's helpful, and based on what I've heard here, I think several of you would be able to write a grant that really bridges the gap between different fields of research. And that can be, as an example, we've heard it a few times, you know, how exercise, physical activity is involved in food intake regulation. I mean, that's also two, in my opinion, two different fields that you can nicely bridge. And is it also likely that you can perform the research before others do? That is sometimes also a good something to consider. So sometimes you know that other people are already doing that. So when I've heard several of your presentations, not that I'm having any plans to do some appetite research or so, but I can also guess based on international conferences, okay, that group is already working on that, based on their track record, probably they will finish that next year. So then I'm lacking behind a little bit. So if you know that the other groups are probably likely to do that study and to publish that next year, maybe you should say, okay, that's not what I should aim for. So then, of course, you should define the objectives of the study. What exactly do you want to study? And I put this in capital letters, focus. I think it's very tempting to say, oh, and we're also going to look at this and at this. But what grant reviewers want to see is that you have a clear research question, a focused research question. And sometimes it's better to do less, but do it good, rather than then you want to do too much in a grant. You want to measure all parameters that might be involved. That's not focus. So I think focus is really important. And be realistic. So is it feasible to obtain the answers of your research question during the study period? So sometimes these grant periods are about 4 years or so. So do not claim to solve the entire problem, is what I always say. So make it realistic and include a timeline. And exclude objectives that can turn into a no-go. So if you have a project with 4 key questions, and if question 1 turns out to be negative, does that mean that question 2, 3, and 4 are irrelevant and you shouldn't do that? Why would somebody give you €500,000 or dollars or whatever if they're not sure after the first study in the first year, if that turns out to be negative? They don't usually say, give me back the money then, right? So maybe they just don't give you the money because they think, oh, this is a high-risk study. Some, especially for the pilot grants, they ask you to include go, no-go criteria. And I have an example based on my own experience for that. So some organizations do ask for that. And of course, then you should really clearly explain what your go, no-go criteria is. And of course, it's good that you question whether or not your idea is innovative. Especially when you go for an innovative pilot grant, for example, you should have a novel idea, and it may be a little bit more high risk then. Okay, so this is one first example that I would like to share with you. And I've been talking about this a little bit on the first day of this summer school, right? Adipose tissue function, and then I said, well, the oxygenation of the tissue might be important. So the basis for that research grant that I've wrote then was that several animal studies showed that a low oxygen tension or hypoxia was present in adipose tissue and that it may contribute to inflammation. That was the current hypothesis, and that was substantiated by some cell culture studies. But at that time, studies in humans were completely lacking. So this is an example, not a new hypothesis. I wanted to test a hypothesis that was out there, animal data were there, no data in humans. So the first aim was to develop a novel technique to measure actually that amount of oxygen in the adipose tissue in humans. And also to perform a proof of concept study where we wanted to manipulate the oxygen supply to the tissue. In other words, the blood flow, right, carrying the oxygen. And the second aim was we want to compare then the amount of oxygen in the tissue between lean and obese individuals. In other words, is there hypoxia in obese adipose tissue? Okay, so I already said be realistic when applying for a grant, and sometimes you should not aim for the big money. So in this case, I went for a relatively small innovative pilot grant, €50,000, and that was money for about 1 to 1.5 years. And I think I showed this slide, if I'm not mistaken, on the first day. So a novel technique, I'll briefly then explain it maybe again. So we had that microdialysis catheter, 2 centimeter long catheter with a semi-permeable membrane. So oxygen then is present in the tissue, can diffuse into this catheter, and we direct that to that small device which contains an oxygen sensor. So the first question I had was whether if we manipulate blood flow pharmacologically, so if we would locally infuse vasoconstrictors or vasodilators into the adipose tissue, will that change the amount of oxygen present in the tissue? Sounds logic, right? If you don't have any blood flow, oxygen cannot reach the tissue. So if, and that coming back to the go, no-go criteria, I put in that grant, if we're not able to show any changes in oxygen tension when we pharmacologically manipulate blood flow, so quite marked changes, increases and decreases in blood flow. If we don't see any changes in oxygen, let's stop with it, right? So that was the no-go. So what we did is we measured oxygen tension under normal basal conditions. So this is Ringer's solution. We locally infuse a salty solution which does not do anything, but as a control situation. And then we had a 1-hour infusion of angiotensin to a vasoconstrictor. So we knew that blood flow went down, and indeed we could demonstrate that also the amount of oxygen in the tissue went markedly down. Then we had a 2-hour washout period with Ringer's solution, again that neutral solution, and you can see, as expected, that the oxygen tension went back to baseline. And then we had isoprenaline that we locally infused, a vasodilator. Yes, we could demonstrate that oxygen tension went up. So this was a proof of principle study that if we manipulate blood flow, oxygen tension will also change. But then, that's pharmacology. What about human physiology? So we said also, what if we just give subjects an oral glucose load, a glucose drink? Because we knew from previous studies that blood flow will change. So will we be able to, in a physiological setting, be able to monitor changes in oxygen tension there? So this is first of all blood flow in adipose tissue in lean and obese individuals. So as we knew from our previous studies, blood flow is higher in lean individuals. And if you give glucose, blood flow goes up in lean, but not, or sometimes a little bit, in obese insulin-resistant individuals. And yes, this was accompanied by the changes we would expect in oxygen tension. So in the lean individuals, which showed the increase in blood flow, they also showed the increase in oxygen tension, whereas nothing really happened in the obese. And this is just areas under the curve. So that is a little bit about the content of the data. And this is what I showed you 2 days ago. So we surprisingly found, despite that lower blood flow, increased oxygen tension in the obese. And now we know that it's probably due to the lower metabolic rate of the tissue. But these were the first findings from the research line that we're still working on right now. So from research question to project proposal, let me come back to that. It's very important to choose the correct experiments or the experimental model. And the crux thereby is that the experiment should give a clear answer to the research question. And as I say here, this is often not the case. And as an example, some people prove they can show causal relationship between factor A and B, whereas basically based on their study design, they can only show an association. So be very clear with that, and be very cautious in how you formulate your research question. Otherwise, you know, strict reviewers say, no, you cannot prove that. That's rubbish. You should have chosen another design. So then it's better to not to say I can show causality, but you say in this first study we look at associations. Make also clear to reviewers that you're the one, or your group is the group that can indeed perform the research, and make sure that reviewers can take that from the grant, right? So it's too simple to say, well, they should know our research group. We're famous in the field. They should know that we're able to do that. No, show that. So maybe include previous studies you did, some pilot data showing like using this technique. As you can see in figure 1, we can indeed demonstrate this and this. Then you're convincing the reviewers that you're able, or your group is able to do these experiments. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes a combination of different approaches is really an advantage. So taking it back to my field of research, sometimes you can investigate the relevance in humans, but also not only do the in vivo measurements, but also study underlying mechanisms in cell culture studies or sometimes animal work that can be complementary. So if you have the opportunities in your lab to combine different approaches or different statistical approaches whatsoever, that can be an advantage. So then about the writing part of the proposal. So in your background, of course, you should provide an objective overview of the literature. So what is known, and as I already mentioned, what is the research gap? Do not only use self-citations. So please also cite important papers from colleagues in the field. Not only because that's important to do, but also some of those people might be one of the reviewers, and it's sort of nasty, you know, if you read a grant and you say, hey, they missed my paper, why did they do that? So some people are influenced by that. You want to keep the reviewers a little bit happy sometimes. Clearly indicate why your idea is novel and important. And the last part is sometimes forgotten, so that maybe can go a little bit further than we know that the obesity prevalence is rising and that it is accompanied by a major increase in the prevalence of obesity-related diseases. You can be a little bit more specific, I think, sometimes. And include, I already mentioned that, if possible, some pilot data. And indicate the implication if your hypothesis turns out to be true or not true. So sometimes you can then translate your data to, well, that might has very important implications for prevention or treatment, and it might be a completely novel avenue that we could investigate in future studies. So always, at least in words, say, what does it mean? What does this research will provide us? What is the benefit of this project for society? Then that's what I mean. And what is sometimes forgotten is that really your summary of the abstract is really, really important. So check it 3 times and have somebody else read the abstract. Because if a large number of applications are submitted, right, the first selection is usually made based on the abstract and the CV of the researcher. That's the same, by the way, and maybe Claire will touch upon that, I don't know. But when you submit a paper to a journal, the abstract is really important, and the title as well, by the way. So that is sometimes forgotten. Not all editors read the entire paper before they make the first decision to send it out for review. That's step 1, by the way. So a work plan. So you have the background, describe then the experiments, but avoid too much detail. Make it easy to read. So don't, if you're doing certain lab work, don't include all the buffers that you're using and blah, blah, blah. Now keep to the main issues that you, but make sure that the reviewer understands what you will be doing. Describe also how the outcome of your experiments will answer the objective. And that is often forgotten. So you think, well, based on what I've said in the introduction, the reviewer should understand that if I'm going to do this kind of study, yes, that will answer my objective. But please explicitly mention that at the end of, for example, the first study you're describing in the grant. That can be just 1 or 2 sentences, but I think it's important that you do that. And also indicate how the consecutive experiments complement each other. So why is all the work that you propose really needed? That is also sometimes forgotten. And of course, describe the strengths of the models you're used. And if you know that other models or other experimental approaches are used also in literature, and you think that what you will be doing is better for certain reasons, then explain that. That can also be an advantage and increase your success rate. This is also a very important one. Add a few words on how you would deal with certain risks that are involved. And if you have a backup scenario, that is an advantage. So if you're dealing with a high-risk project and you want to answer a certain research question with a novel technique and so on, if the technique or if that approach will not be successful, what is your backup plan? So if you can provide a backup plan, that is always very good. And provide a clear time schedule. And I would say use a table or a figure to really say, okay, in this period I will finish these experiments, and that it's very easy to for reviewers to judge the feasibility of the project. So irrespective of money involved, just the timeline. Is it feasible? You cannot complete a complex human study in 6 months because you need medical and ethical approval. And so if I'm reviewing grants myself, and if I see that, then I think, well, this is completely irrealistic. And that's what I mentioned before. Be realistic and don't say you can do a lot if that's not really the case. Then something about the principal investigator or the project group. So choose and describe the expertise of the research group. Why are collaborators, if you add them to your project team, are of added value, right? And it can be an advantage if some of your collaborators are working in another field. So if you can connect different disciplines. Sometimes that's, for certain grants or funding schemes, that's very valuable. But also indicate the role of each participant and prevent overlap. So don't include names because just that are famous names, but explain why all the team members are really needed on that project. Describe also how the research is embedded within your research institute. So is there support from the institute and how does it fit? Is there knowledge? Are there really experts also working in your institute that can help you? Highlight major achievements of the applicants, so that comes back to the past performance of the PI, and list the publications, obviously. Well, that's usually just, you've been asked to do that, but sometimes if you're not asked to do, you can just add a few of your, for example, the 5 key publications in your opinion. Okay, so then the exciting process, you've written that, and then you think, now it's time to submit the grant proposal. And you get back, usually after a few weeks or so, some reviewers' comments. And what happens a lot is that your grant is rejected, or you're always allowed to do a rebuttal, but you're not always happy. That's always a trick. Okay, I received that email. You're opening the email. I always say go for a long run or just take a beer and try to relax a little bit first. So what do reviewers look at? So if it's a personal grant, and I mentioned it briefly, I think, it's usually based, well, 50% on your past performance and 50% on the proposal you've written. That's different for a project grant. It's usually the research project itself is much more important. I would say maybe 70-30 or 80-20. So still, of course, the past performance of the PI is important, but the project itself is also very important. More important than in a personal grant, I think. So then you're writing the response to the reviewers, in other words, the rebuttal. So what are the do's and don'ts based on my opinion, right? So if others and also the senior investigators want to add to whatever I'm saying, please do so. But I think it's important to realize that usually your rebuttal is not sent back to the reviewers again. So what does that mean? That means that you can sometimes be a little bit firm if needed, but in a friendly way. So don't say, oh, they're saying this, and don't be angry when you write your rebuttal. Say, okay, they've said that, but that reviewer is, and don't put it in words like is completely wrong, but may have misunderstood what I meant, and then be a little bit firm, right? So don't be too nice always in your rebuttal, but sometimes you must be a little bit firm. So the reviewing, the scientific committee, they will use that to fine-tune your final score. So do not go into too much detail, but just, as I always say, give a general reply, address the major comments. So if there are a lot of comments, and you have had 4 reviewers, and you're only allowed to write 2 pages of a rebuttal, then just pick the most important comments and say, okay, I'm going to focus on that in my rebuttal. And well, that comes back to what I say. Sometimes you need to be a little bit firm. There is no reason also to disagree on all comments. So you can admit if you've made a mistake, right? So sometimes they're wrong. You say, well, indeed, I should have been more clear maybe, but indeed, and then elaborate on that. And if available, add novel pilot data. So sometimes it takes up to 8 months before you get reviewer comments based on the moment you submit it and so on and so on. Maybe in the meantime, you've gathered more pilot data that actually strengthens your hypothesis. You can add that in a rebuttal. So you can sometimes add a figure with panel A, B, C, and D, whatever, if you had some data to convince then again the reviewers. And use the positive comments. This is also a very important comment, I think. Use the positive comments of other reviewers of the same grant, obviously, to tackle some of the comments that other reviewers are saying. So some reviewers say, oh, this is really an excellent design. And when the other reviewer has some certain criticism on design, you can say, well, as reviewer 1 already pointed out, we think that, and so okay, you can use that also sometimes. Okay, then it's the time to resubmit. If negative, yeah, I usually then go for a long run in the evening, but you can also ask for an explanation if you think the points are not that clear. If it's just a general rejection, sometimes you can say, okay, I'll send a nice email, a kind email to the organization just to ask what were specifically the comments. Sometimes they say, oh, it's just based on priority, but sometimes you can get some important feedback. If positive, I think you should certainly celebrate that with your research group. It's a competitive field, so if you're successful, realize that you've done a great job, right? So I think I have a few more slides. How I'm doing with time, is it okay? So after that innovative pilot grant, I applied for a clinical research grant from the European Foundation for the Study of Obesity that I received in 2013. And that was indeed based on the pilot results that well, there were some more data, but some of the slides that I just showed you related to oxygen tension. And it helped, and I think there is too much focus. Let me also use the opportunity I have when I'm standing here. I think there is too much focus on impact factors to judge the quality of a researcher. But I mean, that's how the system works right now. I think it will be different in 10 years from now, but our pilot results with a small grant were actually published in Circulation, which has quite a high impact factor. And that helped, I think, a little bit. But nevertheless, since these data challenge really an existing concept, it evoked a lot of debate in the field. It was not easy to obtain funding for follow-up studies. You can say, well, clear data, published in a high-impact journal, easy money will be there for me. Not at all. So I received, I think, 2 or 3 rejections, and sometimes you think, then I might be, well, I might know who's the reviewer because he's, working on a certain concept, and based on the criticism, I have an idea, but it's sometimes difficult to convince people if you provide new data in a field. Several animal studies showed the opposite. There was some other data, but I had the conviction that no, we should look at this closer in humans. So in the meantime, I was happy that we had some 10 or 20,000 euros still available to do some other pilot work. And we could show in a few subjects that diet-induced weight loss indeed reduced oxygen tension. So that strengthened a little bit the pilot data. And 2 days ago, I showed you the data of the entire study with 15 subjects, and indeed pointed in the same direction as the first 2. But I think when reviewers saw that, they said, okay, that was not only that cross-sectional study, also in that diet-induced weight loss study, only in 2 or 3 subjects, but they show that. So maybe they thought a little bit further. And I think that helped me. So we could do follow-up studies, 3 human studies that are now all either in preparation, manuscripts in preparation, or submitted. And based on the data that I obtained then during those years, I wrote a grant application for the Dutch Diabetes Research Foundation, which was granted in December last year. And that was, as I mentioned, based on both those results in that small pilot grant, as well as the data I obtained during the grant period, which will finish in September this year. And now I can appoint another PhD student in September to do again follow-up studies. So based on my own experience, what I'm trying to say is sometimes you should be, as a young, I consider myself also still a young investigator, 37, but I'm sort of I don't feel, of course, that senior yet. Sometimes you should go for some small grants, try to get some pilot data, and then in a stepwise fashion go for a little bit more the bigger money, I would say. So my last 2 slides, some general suggestions or take-home messages. Start in time. I did not mention that, but you don't write a grant proposal in a week, at least, because sometimes you need to think about certain concepts and so on. So I would say start in time. Make sure it's easy to read, and it may be worthwhile to have your proposal read by a scientist from another discipline or even a layperson. So maybe you have a partner at home. You can say, well, just the abstract, or for some grants you need to write a few sentences for the lay public. Well, that's ideal, of course, to have read by maybe your parents or whatever. So that is sometimes, if they can understand it, well, then you think, okay, for the lay public it might be understandable. Be realistic, so don't promise to solve the entire health problem, but don't be your own reviewer. So do not highlight every potential pitfall. Be a little bit opportunistic, right? If you say, we're doing this, nevertheless, every study has its limitations, but you don't need to mention all of them, right? That's the task of the reviewers, to identify the limitations. And define clear objectives that really will be answered within the time period. So again, the word realistic comes in. And elaborate on the innovative aspects of the project. Why is it worthwhile funding your project? When we talk about the writing process, I think you should use short, repetitive sentences to summarize throughout the proposal. So really make sure the reviewer understands everything you're saying by summarizing so now and then what you've said in that paragraph. Use figures, maybe to explain your hypothesis. Study 1 will do this, study 2 will this, so that the project is clear from maybe one figure. And I mentioned that already, a timeline in a table of figure. If possible, use the pilot data you've gathered. And do not give up. And I think this is, read this twice and think about it 6 times, that even the most brilliant scientists have experienced multiple rejections. And in fact, if it's not accepted for funding, realize that most research proposals are rejected. Think about the success rate again. So even if you look at all the scientists publishing in Nature, Science all the time, they receive more rejections than grants are accepted. So this is the last slide. Never give up. So I hope this was a little bit helpful. Maybe not for you now. I can imagine that it's not that relevant for some of you now, but I think it's good that you have heard what is important when you talk about grant applications. So.
I have 3 questions actually. The first one is a quite short one, I think. When you write the CV, do you think it's important to include the age index and number of citations and so on? Because I've had one application where the foundation asked for it, and then I wasn't sure if I should include it in all CVs or if it's important to include or not.
Yeah, that's what I meant with the focus on impact factor and number of citations. I mean, I think it depends on the career stage, and it relates to past performance. But as a young investigator, of course, your H index, if I don't know if everybody knows what it is, or the average impact factor, if you just have 1 or 2 publications, what does it tell you, right? You can be lucky and have a high impact factor and say, oh, my mean impact factor is 15 based on 1 paper. So usually that is more important if you're more senior. That tells you a little bit about the average quality of the work, because in general, and I have some doubts about the focus on the impact factor, but in general, the average impact factor or the H index is a measure of past performance of the principal investigator. So to come back to your question, should you add it? I would add it as a young investigator if you're applying for your first grants when they ask for it, but the reviewers at the same time should realize that maybe you have 6 papers submitted, or even if they have been accepted a year ago, of course they're not cited yet, right? So it's not really relevant then, but usually they ask for it.
Okay. Yeah. And my second question is, when you talk about the applications, because I'm always struggling a little bit with writing that section, because I think it very easily becomes very fluffy, if you know what I mean. And I think also that when you speak about the implication, I think it's, I'm having trouble writing that, for example, this project could lead to political changes or something like that, because I think it's maybe a little bit naive to think that one study could really change policy directions. Yeah. So I was thinking maybe you could say something about finding that balance.
It's a difficult one when you say fluffy. What you could do for some grants, it's really helpful if you, after a very short introduction, immediately come up with your hypothesis and then go on with the other aspects, rather than what a lot of us tend to do. Yeah. Okay, this is known. Animal studies show this, or in whatever field you're working, building up the evidence, and then come up with your hypothesis. Sometimes it's better to mention that rather at the beginning of your proposal. That's my experience. Yeah. Because, of course, when they've read the abstract, they should know, but then start from that. You're keeping the attention, you're attracting the attention of the reviewers, and they postulate that. Why? And they might become a little bit curious if you already mentioned, maybe, especially if it's a novel or challenging hypothesis. Yeah. And then it's all about, realize that grant reviewers sometimes have to read like 20 grant applications on a Thursday evening. Yeah, what would you do? And they're already busy, they're running their clinic, or they're running this is all extra work, what we all do. And so you should really be clear and make your point quite clear early in, especially if it's a 20-page grant application. That's what I would say. But I don't know if the other seniors would like to add something to what I'm saying, or correct me if you think you have other experiences. You have.
I have
sorry. Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah. No, I thought Kirsi wanted to add maybe, but okay.
When you talked about the past performance and expertise in the group, I was just wondering if you have an idea about where it should be written. If it should be, because the grants that I've been applying for, they have very strict templates that should be filled out, and you need to write. Yeah. For example, where is the project taking place? Is it then in that section where you should write the past expertise, or should it be in the protocol, or?
Yeah, it can be. Sometimes you have to, or quite often you have to indicate if you have project collaborators. Who are the collaborators, and not only mention the affiliation, like it's Professor X working in Italy, but maybe add, even if it's just 2-3 sentences, who is an expert in vascular function measurements in humans? Because if you then have that in your grant application, okay, he or she is collaborating with an expert in the field. Yeah. And you can maybe then add, if that's important for your application, who recently demonstrated that vascular function plays a major role in diabetes development or whatsoever. That you pinpoint the expertise of your collaborators. That is, you can do that in the section where you mention your collaborators. Yeah.
There is one thing that I wanted to bring up. That is, sometimes the foundations or the money givers, they already in the application or the information text, they say what kind of titles or what kind of sections for the application they expect to be included. And those kind of instructions, I think they should be followed very, very carefully, so that that's related to number of applications. If the reviewer is not able to find the information under the title which he or she expects, he or she gets irritated. Where's the information? If he or she has to try to find it somewhere.
Yeah, that's, I think, a good comment to add. Yeah. So closely look at the instructions. Also, number of words allowed to use for a certain section, whatever. Of course, that's, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much.